Welcome to part 2 of my video series on Claymore. If you haven't watched the first video, why you should read/watch Claymore, please pause this video and head on over to that one. I feel like this video series should be watched in order because each new one will build upon the previous video, or that's my intention anyway. I may not raise the same points in a newer video because I repeat myself enough and I'm trying to keep these more concise and congruent. If you have seen the first one and feel like listening to my nonsense for a little longer, thank you for your continued support, and I hope you enjoy this video as well. This video is going to be assuming you've seen the anime by now, or have at least read the manga up until where the anime ends, which is during the Northern Campaign in Pieta. If I encouraged you to give Claymore a chance and you enjoyed it, then I've done my job so far. I understand that most people don't have time to read an entire manga to finish a story they like. If I wasn't laid off at the time of rewatching Claymore, I can't say for sure if I would have read the whole manga at that time. I'm glad I did though, because I finally got to finish this amazing story, and an incomplete chapter of my life came to an almost perfectly satisfying end. I only wish there was a little more development for a few characters, as well as another chapter or two at the end of the manga. With the way that the story ended, I feel like there's even enough to lead into a sequel, if that's something the author ever felt like doing. This video is for the people who don't know about the differences between the manga and the anime, and why it really needs a proper adaptation. I'm going to be going over the few differences between the two mediums, but the main focus of this video is going to be stressing the importance of sticking to the source material when transitioning from a manga to an anime. I'm going to be using a few examples of other stories that went through an adaptation of some sort, so I can paint a clearer picture of what I'm talking about. I'm going to try and avoid talking about too many different stories because I'm afraid I'll muddy the waters. I have a few distinct examples that come to mind, but I also chose them because they are more popular and the parallels will be more easily drawn. I don't want to sidebar for too long, but I just want to reiterate my true intention with this series, and that is to have a proper and finished anime adaptation for Claymore. It wouldn't be the first time a lesser known series gets attention that leads to it being resurrected bigger and better than ever before. I honestly feel like if the fans of the Claymore series are vocal enough and can create enough attention, this anime will be completed someday. So to all of you watching this, liking these videos and sharing them wherever you can will go a long way towards making that a reality. Enough of my rambling intro, now let's get into why Claymore deserves a proper anime adaptation. The first thing I need to hash out is what actually is a proper adaptation. The main manga I'll be using as an example throughout this video is another one of my favorites, Berserk. I briefly mentioned Berserk in the intro to my first video, but my generalized overview of Berserk doesn't really begin to do it justice with how complex its world and its characters are in the grand scheme of things. For a closer look, you'll need to put your glasses on. So put your glasses on. Berserk began way back in October of 1989 and still hasn't been completed to this day. The author has woven an incredible tale up till this point, and I made the unfortunate mistake of reading the manga. I too now live in the terrible limbo known as the hiatus that occurs between each chapter's release. The installments of Berserk are anything but regular. I'm not alone in hoping that the author lives to finish it someday, and I'm still alive when he does. If only I had never read that damn first chapter. If you hear the emotion in my voice when I talk about Berserk or Claymore, it's because I care very deeply about these stories. Especially during times like this, where everyone is quarantined, media like shows, movies, and video games are so crucial to everyone maintaining a certain level of sanity. I know that I'm not alone with my emotional investment in these stories. I know that a lot of people have their own struggles and their own way of coping with them. Knowing that so many of us choose to distract ourselves with the immersion that stories like Berserk offer, it's no surprise that people can react with such vitriol to an anime that is poorly adapted from its source material. I'm not free of passing judgment onto other people's reactions and thinking they need to get over it, if they don't like an anime or a movie adaptation. But I really should remind myself that someone may have been going through an extremely hard time in their life when that certain story came along and gave them escape from their emotional burdens. I feel that fiction writers are struggling artists themselves, and the characters they create or the stories they tell are their creation and contribution to the world. Much like a painter that has something inside them that can only be expressed through the canvas upon which their art goes, the pages fiction writers fill with their ideas is their canvas. It's something I'm sure they feel has to be expressed and can only be expressed in that manner. That's really why having a proper adaptation is so important when making an anime like Berserk. You have countless fans that are so emotionally invested in the characters that the author has created. An adaptation from existing source material has more weight that it carries because you have an invested fan base from the get-go. An artist has a very clear vision of what it is they are expressing, and the studio adapting it to anime should have the primary intention of bringing that vision to life, showcasing the artist's masterpiece in the best gallery they can construct, rather than the highest price they can sell it for. Due to its long-running nature, Berserk is such a difficult story to adapt into an anime from the source material. The manga is brilliant, and the 1999 anime, even with its flaws, is amazing as well. Berserk is probably one of the best structured, written, and illustrated stories you'll ever pick up. It's another tale I can't recommend enough if you haven't seen it. I hope this doesn't become perceived as a hot take, because I'm sure I'll offend someone with what I say, but I'm about to make some pretty controversial claims. Brace yourself if you're a diehard fan of Berserk. I think that all of the Berserk anime is pretty good, even 2016 and 2017. Now, I'm sure people pause the video to storm the comments and dislike it immediately, but hear me out a little bit before you write me off. I said pretty good, not perfect. Unfortunately for Berserk fans, pretty good isn't good enough. Whether it's the anime or the manga, Berserk's story starts off during the Black Swordsman arc. Guts is a one-eyed man of few words. When he does speak, he seems to be an emotionally cut-off psychopath. His existence is a desolate one. The brief intermissions between battle offer no respite from the memories of his haunting past, or the demons that torment him nightly. No sleep for the wicked has ever rung more true than for this tortured protagonist. Amid the constant attacks, whether from man or the unholy abominations that inhabit the world of Berserk, Guts' prowess in combat is on full display. His calculated wielding of his crude sword, slick repeater bow, and powerful hand cannon is all executed with a focused fluidity that is clearly developed from constant battle. The Black Swordsman, and the reputation that precedes him, is to be feared. This first taste you get of Berserk is somewhat familiar, but it's a distinct, violent, and twisted flavor of dark fantasy. Dude, I love Berserk. However, the alterations to the anime's representation of this arc is a great starting point for outlining the problems with an imperfect transition from the original medium. The manga lingers in the Black Swordsman arc for a while, but the next episode of the anime leaps to a different part of the story. I almost feel like the introduction to Berserk is a chapter from a completely different book when compared to one of the grandest times in any anime or manga, aptly named the Golden Age arc. It's hard not to feel something just hearing those words when you know what they're referring to. I got into Game of Thrones for sure, but whenever people would talk about it, I was always saying, yeah, it's good, but it's nothing compared to Berserk. I honestly wonder how much of old G. Martin's world was inspired by the work of Kentaro Miura. The Golden Age arc is essentially your classic story of castles and kings, princesses and politics, knighting and fighting, bucking and fucking. The alliteration and rhymes that take place in this story will make your head spin. Before we get into all that juiciness, we need to backpedal a little bit first. The Black Swordsman arc. Over in the blink of an eye. Or is it? If you only watched the 1997 anime, you would think that all that happened was Guts killing the apostle known as the Snake Baron. Berserk 2016 dips back into the Black Swordsman arc with the first episode, but then immediately it transitions into the Tower of Conviction arc over the course of a few more episodes. I feel like both of these adaptations were handled well for the brief parts of the story they cover, but they omit a huge chunk of some really powerful storytelling. The 2016 adaptation actually combines events that happened separately into one crammed mess. Both the current and earlier anime adaptations find themselves on an ever-slippery slope right off the bat. They are already barreling down to a dark place with increasing momentum. The parts that were left out of every animated adaptation is some of Berserk's best character building parts of the entire series. They are fundamentally essential to Guts' overall development. The Black Swordsman arc, the Lost Children arc, the pages that are filled with the events that occur between the Golden Age and the Tower of Conviction arcs are heart-wrenching. These arcs also introduce characters that help Guts realize that his true purpose is more important than the pain and anger that has been overshadowing his heart and clouding his vision. In the first few chapters, we have no idea what caused the injury, but Guts is the epitome of a wounded animal just looking for a place to die. His outward appearance of a black beast is the perfect visual representation of the devil dog that is manifested within. If the eclipse is its birthplace, I feel like these pages are the formative years of the shadow beast that later burrows into the dark parts of his mind and plagues his soul. The deep rift within Guts is created here. There's something powerful about these arcs that is missing from the anime adaptations. Having your first season of Berserk coming out in 1997, I would assume production, technology, and budget would all be determining factors on how you tell the story, no different than today. The studio's obligation here is to do their best attempt with the constraints facing them at the time. I really don't have too many problems with the 97 anime other than a few things like people mentioning since Griffith became king. I'm not sure why they included this, because Griffith hadn't even been reborn into this world yet. The rest could be considered minor nitpicking, other than the events around the Black Dog Knights led by the Apostle Wild. This is a pretty considerable fight and chunk of the story that is omitted here that kind of messes with the overall continuity. I'm really not sure why they could have the fight with Zod, but not the one with Wild. Maybe it was budget, but it's very unfortunate because you could always start off Season 2 with revisiting what you skipped over after Guts kills the Snake Baron. The exclusion of Wild is really the only major problem with the anime from 1997. You could also make the argument that failing to include Salat in the Bakiraka as well as the appearance of the Skull Knight for the first time is a failure as well. Salat's exclusion is perhaps a little more significant because it makes it a little harder to include him later, but the Skull Knight could be easily remedied with a flashback, as something Guts could have believed he had hallucinated or was a bad dream. If I were to nitpick just the first episode of Berserk, one thing it's missing is the capture and subsequent torture scenes that eventually lead to Puck helping Guts escape captivity. Even little things like how Guts faces off against the Snake Baron is better in the manga. The Baron splits a kid in half and drinks straight from the tap. It's metal as fuck. He then orders his man into battle, and that's when Guts springs into action. The way he lies in wait for an ambush among the dead bodies, starts shredding people with the crossbow.
Oh, you're getting shredded.
And transitions into his first swing of the Dragon Slayer.
Oh, shit! This guy just cut a goddamn horse in half!
This kind of art is just badassery to the highest degree. Its purest form. In the anime, he kind of just struts into the frame and starts killing everybody. Don't get me wrong, it's still pretty badass, but the first episode of Berserk is just not up to par with the manga. I could talk about Berserk for hours, but that's not the point of this video. I want to talk about just a few more things before I refocus on Claymore.
Even the horses are cut in half.
Those tiny nitpicking events is one thing, but sometimes there are major plot points that get left out of anime adaptations due to constraints, and it just kills the story in the long run. No lack of money could ever make up for the deterioration of the story that it causes. That's why people hate the newer versions of Berserk so much. Hate for the animation is a symptom of the larger disease. I feel like the animation isn't that bad, and actually does a good job of capturing the shift in Miura's art direction. As his skill increased, Miura's sometimes breathtaking artwork brought his locations and especially his characters to life. Amazing shading and detail overall, he uses distinct bone structure to evolve guts along with the story. I think that's one of the things that the 2016 and 2017 animes actually did well. I'm assuming budget also hindered them and influenced creative decisions heavily on the visual end. My main concerns with the new Berserk animes is the omission of huge things like the Moonlight Boy. In the anime of Berserk, there are so many left out characters and events by the end of Berserk 2017, all you're left with is a big steaming pile of shit. Story, history, interrelatedness, and trajectory. Butchered story, broken history, disjointed interrelatedness, and the trajectory is just a tragic mess. Berserk needs to have a complete reboot after how poorly the anime adaptation has been handled. Low budget should never be mentioned anywhere near something like Berserk. There's no excuse for it. I might have a video on that, but the Berserk market is a little saturated and someone else has more than likely already done it. Now that Berserk is out of the way, I have two other perfect examples I'll mention about poor adaptation. This, and this. Alright, so now that I've covered all three of those poor adaptations in great detail, we can get back to talking about Claymore. Claymore's biggest problem with the anime adaptation is... I'm just kidding. But seriously though, I couldn't think of better examples of poor adaptations than Avatar: The Last Airbender and Death Note. The animated series of both of these shows are incredible. I don't know how they can do such a poor job transitioning them to the big screen, but these are the case studies when it comes to poor adaptations from source material. How you can miss the mark so far is beyond me, but I do have an inkling of a suspicion from a slight notion based on a hunch about what might have been going through the studio's mind. Money, Benjamins, De Niro, the bread, the dough. That's the biggest problem with these and so many other poor adaptations. Prioritizing financial gain over their obligation to the fanbase. It's a crime against humanity. Hitler wouldn't even have done that to my boy Aang. Thank God no other such example of a poor adaptation exists. Now that I got the emotional burdens off my chest, it's time we can start talking about Claymore. I just watched Claymore again so I could refresh the story in my mind for this video. I still enjoy watching it, but as I drew towards the end, my God was I disappointed this time around. During and after the fight between Claire and Rigaldo, I just kept shaking my head and saying, "This is so dumb, why did they even do this?" Unfortunately, it was budget. But was it really budget? You can somewhat excuse a few of the mistakes from the Berserk anime because the manga has been going for so long and there's still so much of the unfinished paths in the story. You don't know what you're leaving out of the story if it isn't finished yet. I understand that the manga for Claymore was ongoing at the time of the anime's production, so the story was still being told as well. Regardless of that fact, Madhouse really did do an excellent job of adapting the anime until we reached the battle in the north. Up until that point, it really was just small changes, what I like to refer to as the nitpicking stuff. It's the events that take place in the north that really ruin the anime to the point that it was damaged beyond repair. In the first video, I briefly stated that it's possible to use the original ending, but I have since changed my mind. That statement came from a place of desperation as I was willing to compromise in order to have the anime finished. I'm stronger now. The anime needs to be redone from the point of Claire's final moments in her battle with Rigaldo. No compromises. The rest of the anime up to that point can have some touch-ups. A light restoring or remastering in the early episodes, mainly where some of the animation looks stiff or odd, and that would go a long way to bringing this anime into the future. If a studio feels they can remaster each episode in its entirety with a proper wrap-up to the battle in Pieta, I certainly won't argue. The problem with trying to adapt the next installment of the anime from the 2007 original is you sacrifice too much emotion from those pages before the time skip and butcher the overall continuity. I'll briefly touch on the smaller variations I spoke of before discussing the more significant ones. Every decision you make when adapting source material should be carefully considered, no matter how seemingly mundane or insignificant it appears to be. That's why I gave the example of what happened during the battle that Guts had with the Snake Baron in Berserk. Those kind of differences have no effect on the overall story. Now if you take the Moonlight Boy, something that has already influenced the story, and hasn't even fully developed yet, it all goes back to that slippery slope I spoke of earlier. If you take too many creative liberties, you're setting yourself up for failure later on by creating too much of that downward momentum. You're essentially leaving yourself no safety net either, if you didn't have enough forethought to leave yourself a way to fill in the gaps through a flashback or some other plot device. Once that deviation is set in stone, the adaptation sinks like one. Let's start going over these small differences in the anime from the manga, beginning with the first 4 episodes. During these episodes, there is only omission and slight variation. Episodes 1 and 2 are the first 4 chapters of the manga. The fight that takes place in Rocky's house goes slightly different, but the overall outcome is the same. Claire doesn't cut the Yoma's arm off immediately upon crashing through the roof, and she leaps around a little bit more, as there is an actual fight. It's small, but we really get to see the progression of Claire's baseline strength at this fight. Almost seems not worth mentioning, but I'll explain why it's something I bring up in a minute. Rocky then asks Claire her name before she leaves the village, rather than how in the anime he asks her after the Yoma that uses him as a hostage is slain. We then miss out on another job that Claire completes, as well as the first time the reader is introduced to Ruble. After slicing the Yoma's head in half, we cut to Claire bathing under a waterfall. It's unfortunate that this was taken out not for the sake of seeing an attractive young lady nude, but we miss out on the beauty of these type of moments. So many mangas are full of these quiet moments that have such powerful impact on the pacing of these stories. So many 2-page spreads or panels without dialogue have something amazing that I failed to put into words. The picture itself is worth 1,000, as they say. With a little exposition, we are informed of Claire's next job through the conversation with Ruble. It's here that Claire slays multiple Yoma, including the flying one, while Rocky is still nowhere to be seen. After another brief interaction with Ruble in passing, the next chapter starts out with Claire discovering Rocky collapsed in the desert and ends with her offering the position of cook until he finds a place to live. The next episode is the Black Card and has a near-perfect adaptation from the manga other than the start of it taking place with her killing the group of Yoma that had the flying variant, as well as the bit of exposition we are given through the conversation that Rocky has with Ruble in the inn. In the manga, Rocky just follows Claire up the mountain and we are given all the same information through their conversation. Episode 3 starts off with the monks in the holy city of Rabona discussing the need for a Claymore to slay the Yoma lurking in the citadel. That doesn't happen in the manga, but we can assume that a similar conversation took place anyway. There's a brief moment where Rocky makes Claire smile, but there's a shift in tone during the conversation that Claire and Rocky have after Gawk and Sid leave their room. Claire seems to be more cold towards Rocky and tells him at that time that she spoke to Vincent about Rocky staying in Rabona. It just further illustrates Claire still has her walls up and really only feels pity for Rocky at this point. It's small, but I feel like this bond bears more significance after we see her saved by him a few chapters later. Chapter 7 shows us Rocky getting multiple well-deserved punches instead of just the one. The final difference during the Rabona arc, and one that I feel they made the correct decision to remove it from the anime, is the awkward kiss that Sid forces on Claire. Kind of a Me Too moment anyway, and it doesn't fit into the story at all. It really served no other purpose than I guess it showed that Sid has grown from his experience fighting alongside Claire. Not really sure. It literally never goes anywhere, even when Sid comes back into the story later on. We also aren't shown Gawk giving the sword to Rocky, but it does apparently happen because Rocky says where he got the sword from once he starts fighting Ophelia. It may seem like I'm really overanalyzing these differences because they are so subtle, but I'm forming the background for my opinion on how the variations affect the story later on. The omissions, variations, or creative decisions in the story thus far has no change on the actual outcome like the more serious ones do. The Teresa of the Faint Smile arc is perfect in its anime adaptation, and thank Rimuto it is, because it's definitely one of the best arcs in any anime or manga. It's full of those powerful, quiet moments I spoke of. It's impossible not to get emotional throughout the course of Claire's and Teresa's bonding that takes place. After we return to the future, the only difference that takes place during their fight with the male awakened being is not showing Galatea watching them until the fight is over and Miria fails to mention what a crazy bitch Ophelia is. We find out that Miria forgets to mention it through a small flashback once Ophelia and Claire start fighting. But just before that, we get a small insight into how much more powerful Claire has become since the Awakened Being hunt. The start of Chapter 31 shows Claire dispatch 3 Yoma almost simultaneously. She is already honing her Yoma power detection technique thanks to the Awakened Being hunt. That was what I was referring to when I talk about us getting a baseline indication of Claire's strength when she fought the single Yoma in Rocky's house. Even with this boost in Claire's overall strength, it is as Miria said, they are no match for the top 5 and they should be avoided at all costs. The appearance of Elena and the gift of her arm is the only thing that saves Claire's life and as a result, other lives later. It's essentially the first power boost moment of Claymore, and I feel like that really sets up the leaps in strength that come later on in the story. After her fight is finished with Ophelia, Claire faces off against Ruful, and is joined by Jean after going separate ways from Galatea. That's when Claire is given the assignment to go to the north by Rubel. Accompanying him is Raffaella, the unnamed Claymore that was given the task of killing Elena for deserting. In the anime adaptation, Rubel tells Claire that the boy she was traveling with was seen headed north. But in the manga, he says that Rocky was captured by slave traders and was being sent to the north. There's some additional details here I would like to go over more, but I feel like those topics are better covered in the next video. With the small differences out of the way, from here I'll be going towards the end of the anime where the actual big differences start happening. The main deviations that start to affect the story and send the adaptation into an overall tailspin take place way later around chapter 55 of the manga, and roughly the end of episode 19 of the anime. In chapter 53, we get a clearer understanding of why Undine was so terrified, leaving her crying and trembling in the closet after their earlier battle with the first 3 awakened beings. It's clearly illustrated that the one controlling Yoma power is able to influence Undine's body and he forces her to almost awaken. This gives a better lead up to hers and Denova's emotional conversation and subsequent bonding. After the battle, Flora and Claire use a small sparring match to test out Flora's wind-cutting technique versus the quicksword technique of Claire's, or Elena's depending on how you look at it. In the anime, it just seems like Flora doesn't trust Claire, but in the manga, there is the addition of what seems to be Flora questioning whether it would be more beneficial to have Claire in another team, or perhaps leading one herself. This experience strengthens their bond as well, and there is no need for Jean to step in as she never even shows up. At this point, Rocky finally joins up with Priscilla and Easley. While their initial meeting is in the same place in the ruins of that town, they are not traveling through the snow like in the anime. Rocky also mentions how he was able to escape the dungeon he was being held in, implying that Rubel was telling the truth when he said that Rocky had been taken by slave traders. In chapter 56, Rocky awakens in a seemingly nice house with Priscilla cuddling up next to him. He leaves his bedroom and sees Easley practicing swordsmanship and is reunited with the blade of Rabona that was given to him. After agreeing to Rocky's request to train him, Easley excuses himself and goes into the other room to discuss the northern campaign with Rigaldo. He then orders the remaining forces of his army go forth and annihilate the town of Pieta. While this all happens in the anime, the change of settings and pace of travel that Rocky, Priscilla, and Easley are taking is where this starts to veer very far off course. After ensuring the town is fully evacuated, the 24 prepare for the impending doom approaching on the horizon. Chapter 57 starts out with Easley on a cliffside talking about the battle taking place in Pieta. While it is very similar to what happens in the anime, this is also where Rocky's story goes in a completely different direction. We then go right into the battle between Rigaldo and the remaining Claymores in Pieta. Rigaldo comments how they've lost 3 to the Claymore's 5, and cannot allow any more losses. Instead of all the awakened beings pulling back the moment they hear Rigaldo approaching, the silver-eyed Lion King jumps straight into battle to eliminate the team leaders. While it happens quickly in the anime, this assault appears to be even faster as Undine is unable to even react with blocking Rigaldo's first strike. Rigaldo kills the other team leaders and mortally wounds Jean before setting his eyes on Miria. The battle between Claire, Helen, Deneva, and Miria goes the same right up to Claire's legs awakening and when she goes in for the final blow on Rigaldo. We've finally arrived at the exact leaping off point for the anime where they ruin the story and start blazing their own trail. In the anime, Rocky leaves Eastleigh and Priscilla behind to show up in Pieta and cannot, in his mind, help Claire. The wounded are gathered in a broken building and Cynthia and Tabitha are taking care of the wounded. Rocky cries like a little bitch, and Claire requests Helen to take her head after she defeats Rigaldo. Off somewhere else for no reason at all, Priscilla senses Teresa and Claire and goes into her awakened form from the terror she still feels from Teresa's overwhelming presence. Claire senses Priscilla's transformation and rushes off to go after her. Priscilla flies off to some volcano conveniently located nearby, and the two have the stage set for the apparent finale of the show. Helen, Miria, and Deneva chase after them. Galatea somehow teleports hundreds of miles in an instant and points them to where Claire is fighting. 2 more things that actually happen in the manga then take place in the anime. 1 is the awakening of Claire's arms, and 2 is the sacrifice Jean makes to bring Claire back from awakening. Claire defeats Priscilla, Rocky cries some more, and they talk about leaving the organization. Roll credits. Aside from those 2 things I mentioned, none of this happens. Rocky showing up in Pieta, how he discovers Priscilla as an awakened being, the volcano, the fight, Galatea's appearance, Eastleigh watching, none of it. I have no idea why they went off and did this, but I need to quickly explain the actual events that take place in the manga before discussing why this is such a huge problem. Chapter 59 starts with Claire's legs awakening and ends with her arms awakening when she delivers the final blow to Rigaldo. The artwork here is amazing, and this is literally one of my favorite panels in the whole story. I really like how different the awakening taking place in Claire's body is illustrated, with her original arm and Elena's gifted arm showing 2 distinct evolutions. It's as Rigaldo says, magnificent. Chapter 60 then shows Claire in her nearly complete awakening before requesting that Helen take her head as she is the only one who can strike from that distance. Claire is not in control of her body and wishes to die a human. That's when Jean steps in. These last few panels of Jean are heartbreaking. I couldn't help but feel a punch to the gut when I saw Jean's face for the first time again, or when she starts speaking to Claire. Before I knew it, Jean had become such an amazing character, and you can't help but feel an emotional connection to her. This is by far one of the saddest moments in the entire story, right up there with Teresa losing her head in front of Claire. This moment ends with Jean's lifeless body collapsed on the ground and Claire in human form. This panel crushes me every time I see it. There is no time for Claire or the reader to fully grieve Jean's sacrifice before you are immediately reminded of their current situation. Miria's thoughts give us a quick description of how events have been going since Rigaldo showed up in town, and the other awakened beings clearly did not pull back, as there is only 6 of the 24 left standing. Back on her feet, Deneva takes up Undine's sword and says farewell to her captain. Also super heartbreaking. I don't know how Yagi can make you form such an attachment to a character after such a short amount of time. The final panel of Chapter 60 shows the last 6 Claymores standing in front of certain defeat. Chapter 61 begins with Deneva helping Claire regain focus before the monsters are right on top of them. After Claire raises from her knees and all of them are prepared to die on their feet, we are left with a glimpse of the horrible situation they are in. In most stories, this is the part where Han Solo comes back to shoot down Vader, or the T-Rex shows up to eat the raptor. Unfortunately, there is no one coming. All we are left with is this panel and the horrible feeling of impending doom. The battle is clearly drawing to an end. We then cut to the organization's headquarters in Sutafu. After a brief conversation between the leaders, we also see that Galatea is in the lands far to the east, nowhere near the battle in the north. Here we see that the organization intends to eliminate Galatea because of her insubordination, and her replacement is nearly ready. We then see a few panels of Eastleigh training his new apprentice before Rocky is sent out into the snow to find Priscilla. Upon finding her, we are given some of the final glimpses of the battle, bouncing back and forth from the perspective of the two awakened beings and the Claymores. The two speak of the last Claymore standing as lights being extinguished. In town, we see Cynthia being cut down in front of Helen. Deneva and Claire are trying their best to support each other, while Miria is shown covered in blood and exhausted, surrounded by awakened beings. These panels are the last time the 24 that were sent to the north are seen alive. After going back to the cliffside, Priscilla and Eastleigh let the reader know that one by one, the final lights go out until none remain. If I were in charge of the production of the 2007 anime, this is where I would have chose to stop the first season if I were purely operating within the budgetary constraint. I understand that budget was a huge factor, and if I remember correctly, I read somewhere that the studio was told they would not get a second season before they had even completed working on the first. Regardless of that fact, they had no need to go off and start telling their own story like they did. All of the stuff they needed to finish this part of the story was already there. There's no way you can tell me that the fight between Priscilla and Claire in the volcano and the ending with the four of them talking about going their separate ways was cheaper than the cost of actually just finishing the story properly. They made the second season impossible to make the way they ended it. Any studio considering picking it up now is barred from doing so without properly remaking the first season's ending. I don't know if they thought, maybe if we have a crazy fight at the end, they'll have to let us make a second season. We'll figure out the continuity later. Or if they thought, well, I'm bitter, so I'm just gonna make it to where they can't continue the story, even if they want to. Honestly, I have no idea. Neither option is good, but I really hope it wasn't the latter. If budget was purely the reason why they made the decisions they did, they could have easily ended the series right after the fight with Rigaldo and Jean's sacrifice. Both Claire's awakened limbs and Jean's sacrifice to help Claire return to her human form were animated. If they had just eliminated all the stuff that didn't happen, they would have had the money to fill in the parts that did happen. The rest of the story of Claymore is told after a time skip, 7 years after the battle in the north. It follows the new number 47 and the next generation of warriors. There are several more things that occur before the time skip, but that's why I said they should have ended the first season right after the Rigaldo fight. If there is no other money to do the remaining events that take place before the time skip, you can always do them at the start of season 2 if it ever gets produced. There would have been no need to remake anything. Their poorly executed attempt to use their money efficiently ended up being more costly in the long run. It wasn't just the story that the anime butchered, it was also the hopes of it ever being completed, just like Berserk. I still have quite a bit to say about Claymore, but I feel like this is a good stopping point for this video. If you've watched the anime but haven't read the manga by now, you'll at least have the proper story of the events that took place in the battle for Pieta. I didn't want to include any spoilers beyond the time skip, because the story from here gets absolutely crazy, and the way everything goes down, man. I am so glad I finally got to finish this story. Right now, I'm recommending that if you watched the show and enjoyed it, you should definitely read it as well. We may never get the anime adaptation this story deserves. I pray every time that I think about it, that someday enough demand for it will lead to it becoming a reality. The studio that handles Berserk was just bought by Netflix, and the director of the Castlevania series has expressed some interest in adapting it. I know that I said a studio's focus shouldn't be on money, but for someone to not see the financial potential that something like Berserk has to offer, That person probably shouldn't be in charge of making business decisions for that company. Berserk is too popular to not get right forever, and studios can't get away with making bad adaptations forever. It's certainly possible to have an exceptional anime adaptation someday, as numerous shows have already done it. There have already been trailblazers when it comes to this industry. That's why I still hold out hope for Claymore. I can't give up on it. In the first video, when I said that some of the best stories I've ever had the pleasure of picking up were from anime and manga, I meant it. The stories that hail from the Far East have a special place in my heart. The culture of Japan and its history breeds creativity that just isn't in my part of the world. Don't get me wrong, we have some pretty good stuff too. I read The Hobbit as a kid and it's still one of my favorite books to date. It's unfortunate that some of the greatest Western stories get lackluster adaptations as well, especially since some take 74 years to come out. I love Claymore so much. It's definitely one of my favorite stories, but I can only read it. I can reread it and look at the pictures down to the minute detail for as long as I want, but there's something missing that comes from watching an anime. Once you see the visual world of things like Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings, it enhances your ability to picture characters and places when you come back to read it again, or for the very first time. You can hear the characters' voices. You see the change in expression on their face. You hear the music that was scored for your favorite scenes. All of this is missing from the written form. There's something very special that shows and movies provide. That's why it's one of the best ways to appreciate art. That's why I can't give up hope on Claymore. That's why Claymore deserves a proper anime adaptation.